All right, let's go ahead and jump into our lesson for next week related to Jacob from Genesis 29:16 to 30. Of course, this is a familiar story, but I hope we can add a few insights to it that will make it even more interesting. I started out the focus question about asking what kind of work do you enjoy? Sometimes that may be a hobby, or maybe the Lord has prospered you with a position, a job, where it's just pure joy for you to go to work and enjoy life. And I tell you what, there's something to living a fulfilled life because you enjoy what you're doing for the Lord and for the job that He has given you that's so fulfilling. But we're also going to see a very important principle that's all throughout Scripture, and that's the custom, the law of sowing and reaping, right? In God's economy, it is very much part of what happens, and Jacob is a classic example of it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to be emphasizing today. But we need to remember the big idea that God uses imperfect people with imperfect lives, and still He can have a plan for those people. Believers need to remember that people reap the actions and attitudes they sow. All right. So Jacob was forced to flee from his family because of his subterfuge in stealing the blessing from Isaac. Of course, Esau's mad. Mom and Dad both suggest, we don't want you to marry one of these Canaanite women around here. Please leave. I don't know if you read that in the first part of chapter 28, but it shows a lot about why God didn't choose Esau. Because Esau had a bad character, and when he saw that it displeased his parents about marrying a Canaanite woman, he goes right over to Ishmael, his uncle, and he marries one of Ishmael's daughters, a Canaanite woman. Yeah. And so, in fact, he'll end up with a couple of them. So anyway, Jacob is making his trek over to Mesopotamia. And when he gets there, of course, right away we're told he's introduced to Rachel. In short order, he falls in love with Rachel. And but what was the tradition that confronted Jacob as far as his desire to marry Rachel? Okay, and that's pointed out early on in the conversation and in the negotiation about this. But Jacob understood the tradition. Still, his desire was to marry the younger daughter. Well, what's he going to have to do in order to earn that prerogative?
Serve his uncle.
He's going to have to work for 7 years to do that. Well, there probably was some assumption on both Jacob's part and Laban's part. Well, maybe over the period of 7 years, maybe Leah will find a husband. And so they agreed to the price. I pointed out in my Sunday school class today that I found it always interesting that Jacob, because of his deception, he had stolen Esau's birthright, the double portion, and he had stolen the blessing from Isaac. And yet when he's on the run, he has zero. He has nothing. And so that's why he's having to work 7 years in order to try to marry Rachel. And Jason did bring up the point, but let me just mention, why did Jacob have to work for 7 years to obtain Rachel's hand in marriage? Right. You have to remember, in this economy, a daughter in a home was an asset. She was a contributing member of the household. What she earned was part of the benefit to the family. And so that's where the idea of a dowry price came in. Because the woman now was going to leave her nuclear family and be joined to her husband's family. So now she's going to be a productive member of that family, but this family is going to lose her productivity. And so that's why a dowry price was paid, because it was an economic exchange. And so that's part of what's going on. Well, Jacob doesn't have anything to offer. And his family's a long way away, and obviously they're not getting involved to set up the marriage and pay the dowry price. So that's what's happening and why Jacob agrees to work for 7 years. And that's explained here in the notes.
I'm glad that changed.
Are you? I guess we're all glad that changed. Yeah. There'd be a lot of us really, really single.
We're missing goats.
Yes. Well, Jana knows, and others that have traveled to the Middle East, it's still a very common thing when we travel over there and have women in our group that they'll come up and be willing to negotiate us for camels if we will surrender some of the women that are in the group. So it still goes on apparently over there.
It'd be a real temptation.
I'm not going to sell you into slavery or into marriage or anything like that. I've seen some pretty impressive camels over there. It crossed my mind.
So what's the best deal you got?
Never mind. Too far off topic here. But Jason pointed out in verse 20 of our text that time flies when you're having fun, and Jacob in that verse, I love it too, that Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but as a few days, because he loved her so much. All right, so he fulfills the time, and he goes back to Laban and says, "Give me my wife. It's time." Well, this is where the reaping part comes in, because Laban is going to pull off perhaps a significantly more important deception than what Jacob had done to his dad. Because after the arrangements are made, the wedding ceremony is initiated. But what happens is, of course, as almost everybody knows, but Leah ends up marrying Jacob, unbeknownst to him. And of course, you can understand in a culture where they were veiled and there would have been very little to identify who she was. But even in the night, you have to understand, Leah had to play a part in this, a big part in pulling off this deception. And whether it was her submitting to her father's rules that you need to do this, or her desire to pull it off and indeed end up with a husband, it is what happened. And that is how the next day is when Jacob realized this was not Rachel. This was Leah. And he confronts Laban in a pretty strong fit of anger. And Laban goes back and says, "Well, you know the custom. I mean, we had to have the older daughter married off first."
The next 7 years seemed like 50.
Okay, Dan, why don't you come and finish the lesson? Because that's a good point.
Who say anything else?
No, say your comments. That's fine. What I do want to point out, though, is that he does agree to work 7 more years. But if you read the text carefully, even though he's taken Leah as his first wife, Laban goes ahead and allows him to marry Rachel. And he'll continue working for 7 years to pay that dowry price. But they are united in marriage. If you look at verse 30, it says that Laban went ahead and gave Rachel too. But again, you see this complicated situation now, and 2 wives involved, but still God is fulfilling his plan. And I've always thought it was interesting. Abraham had to be 90 years old before he ever got the son of promise. Isaac doesn't get married till he's 40. They live for 20 years without having any children. And once again, how is God's covenant relationship and promise to Abraham going to be fulfilled when there are no kids? Well, we have the twins when Isaac is 60. Well, Jacob is going to be the primary contributor to the whole tribe of Israel, because he's going to have the 12 sons, and then Joseph's 2 are going to be part of the tribe, and then we'll get to that when we get to it. In any event, God had promised Jacob that his descendants would be like the dust of the earth, He promised Abraham they would be like the stars in the sky and the sands in the sea. And so all of a sudden, God starts prospering Jacob, and a lot of children start being born. But who are they born to? Leah is the one who ends up with 6 sons. And the comment that I included in the notes is that Jacob clearly loved Rachel. But you see this at the birth of every one of the sons to Leah. She thinks, certainly, this is going to win my husband to me. And yet, that's not the case. Once again, getting ahead of God in some ways. Rachel says, I can't have children. In fact, there's that really interesting exchange. She says, give me children or I die. And Jacob says, well, am I God? What do you want me to do? So Rachel hits on this crazy idea. Here, you have my handmaid. You take her as a wife, and any children that are born to her, I will be right there, and it'll be my children. And so Leah, not to be outdone, says, well, you can have my handmaid too. And so now there are 4. And he was starting to be like Solomon later, who said, honey, you're 1 in 1,000. Okay. Where am I at? Okay.
We don't know.
There are consequences. You'll see my question there at the last point, under point 3. What were the consequences of Jacob's polygamous unions? Well, it was a problem, right? Mm-hmm. Even though there were sons born to these unions, and the tribe of Jacob is certainly growing, there are no circumstances in the Old Testament where we find a polygamous marriage relationship where it ever turns out good. Mm-hmm. There are always problems because it violated God's plan, his perfect plan that he established all the way back with Adam and Eve, right? And so it is funny when you really examine it that none of the polygamous situations that we read about in the Bible ever turn out without serious complications. It does for Jacob too, and we'll get to those when we start talking about the establishment of the tribe. But there's all kinds of rivalry and hatred, even between Leah and Rachel. I mean, there's all kinds of strategizing and bribing and just outright frustration and anger. And ultimately, the point is, though, even in this complicated circumstance that Jacob placed himself in, God was going to ultimately manipulate all of this to fulfill God's plan. And we are the ones that are going to be the beneficiaries of that. All right, so just wrap that up. You can talk a little bit about Jacob being fulfilled in his work. And part of that has to do with finding something to do that gives you purpose. And Jacob had a goal. He had an objective out there to secure Rachel as his wife. And that's why it seemed like days rather than 7 years for him to earn that. But it's true with us. Find something that's fulfilling, working in a way that would glorify God. And whether we eat or drink or whatever we do it heartily as unto the Lord. And that's a fulfilling way to live. Okay, so that'd be one of the takeaways for next week's lesson. Okay, you'll have fun with this one. God bless.